Most crimes are solved with logic, evidence, motive, confession. But some cases, they throw all of that out the window. A girl missing for 24 years, found in the last place anyone thought to look. A man fakes being a missing child, and somehow convinces the family. A hospital room turns deadly, not because of a virus, but because of the patient herself. These aren't movie plots. They're real. Twisted. Unbelievable. And they'll have you questioning everything. This is 8 cases with the most insane twists you've ever heard. Let's begin. Case 1, The Girl in the Basement, Austria. April 2008. A pale teenage girl is rushed into an Austrian hospital. She's barely breathing. Her skin is ghost white. Her name? Kirsten. Her age? 19. But here's what shocked doctors most, this girl had no birth records. No hospital history. No legal identity. It was as if she'd never existed. And when police traced her back to her family, they unlocked a story so horrifying, so twisted, that even veteran investigators wept. A story that had been buried, beneath a house. For 24 years. Back in 1984, Joseph Fritzl, a seemingly ordinary father, told police his 18-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, had run away to join a cult. He even handed them a handwritten letter from her, saying, "Don't look for me." The police believed him. Case closed. But what no one knew, was that Joseph had led Elizabeth into the basement that day, drugged her, and locked her behind 7 doors. He had built a secret dungeon under his house. A reinforced, soundproof chamber. No windows. No exit. A prison built for one. For the next 24 years, Elizabeth lived underground. And it gets worse. Over the years, Joseph repeatedly raped his own daughter. She gave birth to 7 children, all inside that small, dark room. No sunlight. No fresh air. Just a sink, a mattress, and a monster. 3 of those children stayed underground with her. 3 others. Joseph brought them upstairs, telling his wife they had been abandoned at the doorstep by Elizabeth and her imaginary cult. He played the role of savior above ground, and predator below it. Elizabeth taught her children to read and write with torn scraps of paper. She taught them never to scream. Because no one would hear them anyway. And then came Kirsten's medical emergency. At 19 years old, suffering seizures and kidney failure, she had to be taken to a hospital. But she didn't speak. She'd never interacted with the outside world. The doctors were confused. Then suspicious. Then horrified. The police started asking questions, and Elizabeth, after 24 years, was finally allowed out, under the condition that she return after explaining things to police. But when she sat down, she told them everything. The dungeon. The rape. The babies. The decades of terror. The lies. The manipulation. Elizabeth and her children were rescued. Joseph was arrested. When police entered the basement, they cried. Some walked out. One investigator said, "Hell would be a better place than that room." In court, Joseph Fritzl showed no remorse. He was sentenced to life in prison. But the real twist in this case, is how it was possible. How a man built a multi-door dungeon, soundproofed it, maintained 2 families, one above and one below, and no one ever knew. His wife claimed ignorance. Neighbors had no suspicions. The community called him a devoted father. But beneath his feet, his daughter had been missing for 2 decades. It wasn't just a story of captivity. It was a story of how evil can live in plain sight, and how sometimes, the most horrifying prison, is silence. Case 2, The Husband Who Became His Dead Wife. Sometimes, the scariest lies are the ones that look like love. When Sharon Edwards, a beloved schoolteacher from Toledo, Ohio, suddenly went missing in 2004, the community rallied behind her grieving husband, Paul Edwards. He was devastated. On local TV, he sobbed. He passed out flyers. He even held prayer vigils. People hugged him at grocery stores. Strangers stopped to weep with him on the sidewalk. And then, something strange happened. A few weeks after Sharon's disappearance, her email inbox lit up. She was alive, or so it seemed. She emailed her family, friends, co-workers, even her boss, saying she had run off with a man from her past. That she was sorry, but she needed to start a new life. She was vague. But the messages had her tone. Her words. Her digital fingerprints. Her loved ones were heartbroken, but reluctantly believed it. But months passed. Sharon never called. Never returned. Never appeared on video. Only emails. It was Sharon, but also, not. One day, her sister received an email that ended with a phrase Sharon never used. Another included a spelling error she would have never made. Something was off. So they called the police again, and asked them to trace the IP address of the emails. It led back to the last place anyone wanted to believe, Paul Edwards' home computer. Confronted with the evidence, Paul broke. He confessed everything. Sharon never ran away. She never sent those emails. She never had a lover. Paul had murdered her, on the night of a simple argument in their kitchen. He hit her once. She fell. Her head hit the counter. She died. But instead of calling for help, he panicked, and buried her in a shallow grave beneath their garden patio. Then he went into her computer, her journals, her past emails, and used them to recreate her voice online. For nearly a year, Paul sent emails as Sharon. Forged her thoughts. Faked her emotions. Even remembered to argue with people, just to make it feel real. He learned her habits. Her style. Her favorite phrases. He became his dead wife. But here's what made this case so disturbing. Paul had written a novel years earlier. A fictional story about a man who kills his wife and pretends to be her online. He didn't just improvise this cover-up, he rehearsed it. In his imagination. In fiction. At the trial, prosecutors presented excerpts from the book. The similarities were chilling. Paul was sentenced to life in prison. Sharon's body was exhumed, and her family laid her to rest, for real this time. This wasn't just a murder. It was a second life, built on lies, technology, and storytelling. And for a whole year, everyone believed the ghost. Case 3, The Boy Who Wasn't Nicholas. Nicholas Barkley was just 13 years old when he vanished without a trace from his neighborhood in San Antonio, Texas. It was 1994. He had gotten into trouble before, skipped school, argued with his family, so at first, people thought he'd run away. But days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. No sign of him. No call. No note. No sightings. Nothing. 3 years later, in 1997, a phone call came from Spain. A boy claiming to be Nicholas had been found. The boy told an unbelievable story. He said he had been kidnapped by a military sex trafficking ring, taken across Europe, abused, tortured, and finally dumped on the streets. He looked nothing like the old photos of Nicholas. His hair was darker. He had a French accent. His eye color was completely different. But despite that, the Barkley family said, "That's our Nicholas." They flew to Spain. Embraced him. Brought him home. The world watched with stunned sympathy, a miraculous reunion. Or so it seemed. Nicholas, or whoever he was, went on national TV. He did interviews. Told his horrific story. But investigators started noticing strange things. He avoided eye contact. Got details wrong. Didn't recognize childhood friends. He wore hats and scarves, even indoors. His ears didn't match. The real Nicholas had a tattoo. This boy didn't. The truth? This wasn't Nicholas Barkley at all. He was Frederick Bourdon, a 23-year-old French con artist who had impersonated dozens of missing children across Europe. He had seen Nicholas' face on a missing poster. Learned his story. Studied his life. And walked into it. And the family? They believed him, or at least they said they did. So here's where it gets even darker. Why would a family welcome home a total stranger, with the wrong face, wrong eyes, wrong voice? Some investigators began to wonder, did the Barkleys actually believe he was Nicholas? Or were they accepting a fake, because it helped them hide a deeper secret? Frederick eventually confessed. He was arrested and deported. But the mystery deepened. Years later, Nicholas Barkley was still missing. And the more investigators looked, the more they began to suspect. Nicholas may have never run away. Some believe the family knew something about his disappearance. Something they weren't telling. Maybe even something they were covering up. And letting a fake son walk through the door, helped them avoid the truth. A conman pretending to be a missing boy was shocking. But a family who played along, might be even worse. Case 4, The Girl in the Chute, the mysterious death of Phoebe Handsjuk. In a luxury apartment building in Melbourne, Australia, 24-year-old Phoebe Handsjuk was found dead at the bottom of a garbage chute. The scene was gruesome. Her body was discovered in the building's trash compactor room, after falling down a 40-meter steel chute, roughly 12 stories. Her foot was nearly severed. Her body broken, mangled. Her jeans were down around her knees. Her blood was on the floor. The police looked at the evidence, and ruled it a tragic accident. But almost everyone else, especially Phoebe's family, believed they were wrong. Phoebe had recently moved in with her much older boyfriend, Anthony Hampel, a well-connected events promoter with family ties to powerful figures, including judges and politicians. On the night of her death, Anthony claimed she had been drinking. Arguing with him. Upset. He said he went into another room. Hours later, she was dead. But here's what didn't add up. The garbage chute was in a separate hallway. To get into it, Phoebe would have had to 1. Leave the apartment alone. 2. Open a heavy metal access door located 1.2 meters above ground. 3. Pull herself up while heavily intoxicated. 4. Slide herself feet-first into a dark steel shaft only 40 centimeters wide. Even trained officers said they could barely fit. It was tight, awkward, and extremely difficult to get into, let alone voluntarily. There were also bruises on her body that didn't match a fall. Broken glass in the apartment. A half-written note. A damaged laptop. None of it was properly analyzed. Her phone had been wiped clean. The coroner ruled it death by misadventure. Police closed the case. But a private investigation told a different story. The blood trail in the apartment was consistent with someone being dragged. Her fingerprints weren't found on the chute door. Her jeans were halfway down, which would have made climbing nearly impossible. And Hampel? He refused to cooperate with the independent investigators. He lawyered up within hours and was never formally interrogated. Phoebe's grandfather, a retired judge, called the investigation deeply flawed and disturbingly rushed. He believed someone killed her. Possibly staged the scene. And that her death was covered up, deliberately. To this day, the public remains divided. Did a young woman in emotional distress somehow do the impossible, and climb into a narrow garbage chute to end her life? Or was she murdered, and her death buried by the weight of power, influence, and silence? There were no witnesses. No security footage of the hallway. No confession. Just a young woman, and a trail of questions. Case 5, The Piano Man, a mystery with no name. On a rainy day in April 2005, a man appeared, soaking wet, dressed in a black suit and tie, walking alone along the coast of Sheerness, England. He didn't speak. Not a single word. He had no ID. No wallet. No phone. Just empty, frightened eyes. When police approached him, he flinched, terrified, as if he didn't understand language. They took him to a psychiatric hospital, hoping someone could identify him. But still, he said nothing. Not even his name. Doctors handed him a pencil and paper. He didn't write a name. Or a sentence. Instead, he drew a grand piano. Intrigued, a nurse took him to a piano in the hospital lounge. The man sat down. And began to play. What followed would become international headlines. For hours, he played beautiful, emotional music, classical pieces, improvisations, melodies that left staff in tears. Was he a genius? A famous musician? A trauma victim? A missing person? The media named him, the Piano Man. His story made front pages across Europe. Over 200 calls came in, some claiming he was a missing son, a lost husband, or a concert pianist who had cracked under pressure. But here's where the story takes its strange twist. Investigators reviewed the hospital's CCTV footage. And noticed something odd. He wasn't really playing. His hands were just pressing keys. No technique. No coordination. It was all an illusion. The Piano Man was not a virtuoso. He was barely a beginner. His real name was Andreas Grassel, a 20-year-old from Bavaria, Germany. He had a long history of depression. He had previously attempted suicide. And in a final act of surrender, he boarded a ferry to the UK, hoping to vanish. He faked his amnesia. Faked his silence. Not to deceive others, but to escape himself. He didn't want money, or fame. He just wanted to disappear. And in a world obsessed with identity, performance, and explanation, that made him terrifying. We saw what we wanted, a mystery. A prodigy. A miracle. But in the end, the Piano Man was just a deeply lost young man, using silence as his only voice. Case 6, the Yuba County 5, Madness in the Mountains. On the night of February 24, 1978, 5 friends from Yuba City, California, all with mild intellectual disabilities, piled into a Mercury Montego and headed to a college basketball game. They were excited. They had their uniforms ready for a game they were supposed to play the next day. But they never came home. And what happened next would spiral into one of the strangest missing persons cases in U.S. history, filled with impossible decisions, unexplained fear, and an eerie silence that still echoes in the snow-covered mountains of Northern California. 4 days later, the car was found. Abandoned. On a remote, snow-covered mountain road, over 70 miles from where they should have been. It wasn't stuck. The gas tank was a quarter full. The keys were missing. But the car could still be started. Inside were food wrappers. Basketball game programs. Maps. Folded neatly. But no sign of the men. Search teams began combing the woods. Helicopters scanned the forests. Nothing. 4 months. And then, in June, the snow melted. That's when they found the first body, Ted Whiter, inside a trailer 20 miles from the car. He was lying in bed, wrapped tightly in 8 sheets. His feet were severely frostbitten. He had lost over 100 pounds. And beside him, a locker filled with rations and food, untouched. A propane tank. Matches. Books. Everything he needed to survive, but never used. Near the trailer, they found the remains of 2 more men, Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga, scattered along the snowy road. Later, another body, Jack Hewitt, found halfway between the car and trailer. The fifth man, Gary Mathias, was never found. His tennis shoes were in the trailer. But he was gone. Vanished into the woods. Now here's where it gets deeply unsettling. Why abandon a working car in the first place? Why walk 20 miles into snow, in the dark, with no jackets, no supplies, and no plan? Why didn't Ted eat the food right beside him? Why didn't they light a fire? Why wrap himself like a mummy and wait to die, surrounded by fuel and matches? What were they afraid of? A witness came forward. He said he saw 4 of the men at 2 a.m., near the gas station, looking scared. Silent. Refusing to speak. Another man claimed he saw flashlights in the woods that night. One theory. They were being followed. Another. They picked up someone who led them astray. But the truth? No one knows. The media called them the American Dyatlov Pass. 5 men. Mentally vulnerable. In the prime of life. Just, gone. One was never found. The others? Found too late, in conditions that made no sense. There were no injuries. No trauma. No final message. Only that one trailer, with everything they needed to survive, untouched, like they were too scared to use it. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a journey into madness, snow, and silence. And if the mountains of Yuba County could talk, we'd finally know what made them run. Case 7, The Toxic Lady, Gloria Ramirez. It was February 19, 1994, just after 8 p.m., when Gloria Ramirez, a 31-year-old mother of 2, was rushed into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital. She was confused, gasping for breath, and her heart was racing. She had advanced cervical cancer, but what happened next had nothing to do with her disease. Because in less than an hour, 6 hospital workers collapsed. And Gloria would become known as the Toxic Lady. The ER team began CPR. They gave her sedatives. Standard procedure. But almost immediately, things turned strange. A nurse drew blood from Gloria's arm, and noticed it smelled like ammonia. Moments later, another nurse saw oily, shimmering crystals floating in the vial of blood. Then suddenly, staff began fainting. One nurse collapsed. Another began convulsing. A third was paralyzed and had to be wheeled out of the room. Within minutes, the ER was evacuated. Gloria remained on the bed, alone, and died shortly after. In total, 23 people became sick. 5 were hospitalized. One nurse spent 2 weeks in intensive care with respiratory and bone damage. But the question that stunned everyone was simple: what just happened? How could a dying woman, with no weapons, no chemicals, no radiation, cause an entire ER staff to collapse? The media went wild. Conspiracy theories exploded. Was it nerve gas? A secret lab experiment? An infectious chemical weapon? The CDC was called in. So was a hazmat team. The autopsy was done in hazmat suits. Eventually, investigators gave a theory. They said Gloria had applied a homemade topical treatment made of dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, a solvent often used for pain. They claimed this chemical, mixed with her cancer treatments and oxygen in the ER, somehow transformed into a deadly gas, causing mass hysteria. But here's the problem. That theory has never been proven. And none of the other patients treated that night had any issues. Just the room with Gloria. Her family. They didn't believe the toxic gas explanation. At all. They believed something happened in that hospital room, and Gloria became a scapegoat. To this day, the Gloria Ramirez case remains unsolved. Her body was so badly decomposed by the time it was finally examined, few answers could be extracted. What was in her blood? Why did the ER workers collapse? Why didn't it affect everyone? And how could a woman, dying of cancer, be the center of such a strange, dangerous event? They called her the toxic lady. But maybe, she was the victim, not the threat. And maybe the real mystery was never about science at all, but about what happens when fear, pressure, and uncertainty meet, in a single room. From forgotten basements, to fake identities, to madness on a motorway. These 8 cases weren't just about crime, they were about the human mind. About fear. About how truth bends in silence, and how reality isn't always what it seems. We've seen monsters hiding in plain sight, victims lost inside their own homes, and lies so convincing, even the families believed them. And maybe that's the most disturbing twist of all, that the truth, in every one of these cases, was always right there. But nobody believed it, until it was too late. Now it's your turn. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Which one do you believe still holds secrets? Tell us in the comments, we read every single one. And if this episode gave you chills, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more dark mysteries, real crimes, and stories the world tried to forget. This is Shadow Files, where true crime is stranger than fiction.